had the month of October, the time of spooks, candy, costumes, and the scariest of all, midterm exams. So, in preparation for Halloween 2023, I didn't really have any plans. But then I looked back on my most popular YouTube video. Why it's so popular, I'll never know. Second most popular now. Top 4 obscure Thomas the Tank Engine creepypastas. Apparently, you guys really liked it for some odd reason, even though I thought Thomas fans were big pussies and don't like scary stuff. But I guess I was wrong. So, thinking about that video, I decided to continue on this little bandwagon of fake, spooky, hyper-realistic blood internet stories, and just decided to do some readings. So I looked all over the internet on creepypasta sites, forums, possibly some viruses, and so for this year, I just decided that I was going to read some Thomas creepypastas. Now, just to give another disclaimer, these are not real. Creepypastas are fake. They're all fake. Thomas is not going to jump out of the screen. You're not going to find some haunted VHS tape at a yard sale or anything. And James is not going to freaking burn to death. It's all fake. But they're still pretty chilling when you think about it, especially when you read them for yourself. And that is what I'm going to be doing for you guys for this year's Halloween. So, with all that being said, let's get started with some Thomas creepypastas. Have you ever heard of Thomas the Tank Engine? If you have been around little kids between the ages of 2 and around 7 or so, I'm sure you have. My son adored Thomas so much so that he could name every single train, knew what color they were, and the number they had painted on them. I was glad when I heard that he was coming to visit me over the summer, but I had a ton of work to do, so I bought him a Thomas DVD. The cover looked innocent enough. What was also interesting was that Thomas was smiling and little wooden children were waving their arms out of the window in his coaches. The DVD was called Thomas and the Children. He was so excited to see the DVD that right off the bat he pleaded with me to pop it into the DVD player. I went to work while he watched it. After a few hours he came into my office looking as pale as a sheet. His voice seemed very weak. "Are you okay?" I spoke. I touched his hand and noticed that his temperature had gone up. Why did Thomas kill the children? My heart sank like a stone, but I soon brushed it off. "I'm sure Thomas didn't kill the children," I reassured him. "Now you need your rest and some medicine." I gently pushed him toward his room. "Come on now." After putting him to bed, I got curious as to what he had seen. I popped in the DVD and began to watch the episode play. It seemed normal enough. The episode began as Thomas was told to take a group of children to the seaside by the instructions of Sir Topham Hatt. I noticed something was wrong. There was no narrator in this episode. The episode then showed Thomas picking up the little wooden children and showed every single one of them climb on board. Then, there was a scene with him zooming down the rails like he always did, and the kids were cheering. But up ahead, Birdie the bus was stuck on the level crossing, moaning for someone to help him. This is when the episode got strange. Birdie stared at Thomas in fear, but Thomas just smiled and sped up. He laughed, and the kids were crying with tears coming down from their wooden faces. Immediately, Thomas crashed into Birdie, and pieces from both of them flew everywhere. Usually, by now, the narrator would say, "And luckily, no one was hurt," but there was no recurrence for the kids. The episode then showed what happened inside the coaches. Wooden limbs were broken off, What looked like actual blood had been splattered everywhere. We see brief shots of their heads ripped off and tears painted upon their faces. Everything went to static. After that, I felt myself boiling over with anger. What sicko would create something that messed up for little kids? Then I paused the static. Messages started to appear on the screen like kill, obey, multiply, and die. I watched the static, and more different messages flashed on the screen, and on the bottom, one of them said, "Rip Thomas." I threw the accursed thing in the trash after breaking it in half. I would not expose my child to any more of that trash. Before going to bed, I checked him. He was happily asleep and snoring, clutching his teddy. I had a nightmare from this, one where the children came into my room, but they were lifelike and as tall as a normal person. Their twisted forms grabbed my limbs and pulled me apart, while I heard that blasted train laughing. Now I have woken up, covered in blood, knife in hand, and I'm afraid to check my son's room. A young man walked into a garage sale. He had heard there were old video games being sold there and went to check them out. He was an avid collector of SNES games and had almost finished his collection. At his home there were walls and walls of shelves filled with NES games and a few NES games too. They all were very neat, alphabetized by title. When he arrived at the garage sale, he looked around for the games. He saw several racks with clothes on them, some assorted lawn decorations, and a table with a balding man behind it who was reading a book. "Excuse me," he addressed the man. The man looked up from his book. "I heard there be video games here. Do you know where they are?" "I had a bunch of them, but some guy got here an hour ago and took most of them," the man replied. "There's still a few in back if you want to check them out." His eyes followed in the direction the man was pointing in. There were 2 folding tables in the garage with empty shoe boxes on them. 2 of the boxes had games in them, one with NES games and the other with SNES games. He paged throughout the NES games. He didn't collect them, he just owned a few of the better games. Nothing in the bin caught his attention. He then turned his attention to the bin of SNES games. Games had been taken out of it, and there were gaps in between games. He pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket. It was a list of SNES titles, with some crossed out. After looking through the bin, he didn't find any that were on the list. One game, though, had caught his attention. The cartridge read, "Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends." He didn't remember owning any game with that title, but it wasn't on the list. He pulled his phone out and tried to search for the game. No results. All stuff about Thomas the Tank Engine, but nothing about an SNES game. He now felt he was holding something ominous in his hand, something that didn't belong in this world. He clutched the game tightly and brought it to the man. How much for this?" he stammered. The man looked at the game in his grip, and then back at the young man. "Let's say $10, he finished. The young man pulled $10 out from his wallet, put it on the table, then turned and walked away. He got home soon after. He lived alone, so the house was dark and silent. The faint light from down the hall invited him closer. He found himself in the room where his games were. He whispered to himself. His finger traced across the shelf, not finding what he was looking for. There he saw Tetris Attack and Thunder Spirits, but no Thomas the Tank Engine. He looked again at this mysterious game. He figured the only way to find out more was to play the game. As soon as he turned on the game, he was greeted with Thomas the Tank Engine sliding into the screen. He had never liked Thomas's face. It always creeped him out, even as a child. The next screen had him chuckle. It read, "How old are you?" with the options being 4 or younger, 5, 6 or 7, and 8 or older. As a joke, he picked 4 or younger. At this point, his nerves were settled. This was just some crappy edutainment game that people had forgotten about. Maybe it was a bootleg. That didn't really matter now. One of the first things he noticed when starting the game was how awful the graphics looked. He was familiar with SNES graphics, but this looked more like an NES game. He was brought to a menu for the game. There were different minigames available. A robotic narrator read the options. Start Thomas. Thomas's quiz. Let's go with Thomas. The narrator had pauses in between each word it spoke. He hadn't expected it to speak, and the whole narrator came as a surprise. It was quite eerie how lifeless it read its lines. He selected the first option, Start Thomas. It brought him to a sliding puzzle. It wasn't much of a puzzle though. By pressing A twice, he had solved it. He decided that maybe he shouldn't have said he's 4. He looked around at the other games. None of them were too interesting. Basic games that you'd expect from an educational game. After that, he picked the last option. Let's go with Thomas. Words on the screen lit up. Pick an adventure. He selected the second option. Thomas saves the day. The next screen had more options for the game and... Auto? A red box contained the words auto. How would that work? He selected auto. He now realized what this was. It was a story with words and pictures. The picture at the top unnerved him. It seemed to look at him, though his eyes weren't in his direction. His thoughts were scattered by the sound of a voice. It was the robotic narrator again, reading the story. It spoke the words, but didn't read them. It was cold, emotionless.
Every day, sir, caution at train to the station. Hello, he says to Thomas.
On the third screen, the narrator didn't speak. The only words were, "Who is this man?" In a second, the screen disappeared and the story continued. At this point, the narrator's voice was freaking him out. He didn't hear the story, but listened to the words, the voices. Then there was silence. He looked back up at the screen that was illuminating the room. Another question was asked to him. He looked back down at the ground. The narrator's voice began to fill his head once more.
Help,
said the emotionless voice.
on.
Laughed the same voice. At this point, the music had slowed down significantly. It felt sad and hopeless.
Found a search you.
The voice echoed. The man was kneeling on the floor. The controller was out of his hand, but the game continued to play. A puddle of drool was forming on the floor in front of him. The game ended. The screen turned black. The console had reset itself and was playing once again. Thomas slid into the screen and looked directly at him. It was March 5th, 2015. The Adventure Begins, my favorite Thomas & Friends special, had just been released on March 3rd. I was proud of myself for helping with it. That day, I was browsing through a bunch of documents about the show when I discovered one called Thomas and the Unfinished Bridge, Restricted. This got me confused. I kept track of all of the Thomas & Friends episodes, and I knew that there wasn't one called Thomas and the Unfinished Bridge. I asked my boss about this document. "Oh, that?" he asked, seeming slightly concerned. In 1986, an episode was going to be made called Thomas and the Unfinished Bridge, but it never aired on TV. "Why?" I asked. From what I was told, it was supposed to be a regular episode, my boss explained. It was supposed to be the finale of the show's second season. Thomas was doing something normal, and his brakes began to fail. He was going towards an unfinished bridge with a bunch of passengers inside a coach he was pulling. Luckily, Edward saw this and managed to stop Thomas by coupling up to the coach and applying his brakes. Somebody working at the company made a draft of the episode and sent it to the show's main creators in a VHS tape. I think the guy's name was Eric? The company noticed some things in the draft and fired the person who made it and canceled the entire episode. But why? I wondered. We don't even know, and we don't want to either, my boss answered. So what happened to the VHS tape? I asked. I've been told that the company kept it, but it was stolen by somebody. Nobody knows where it went, he said. When I got home that same day, I searched Amazon for anything called Thomas and the Unfinished Bridge. Surprisingly enough, I actually found an old VHS tape with that name being sold by an account which had a username of a bunch of random characters, letters and numbers specifically. I ordered the VHS tape. It took 8 days for the tape to arrive before it finally did on March 13th. Friday the 13th, what an odd coincidence. I connected my VCR to my TV and inserted the tape into the player. There was no title screen. Instead, the episode just started. This was understandable because apparently the tape contained a draft. It started off normally enough, with a shot of Thomas chugging through a forest happily, carrying a coach full of passengers behind him. There were two things that were slightly odd, though. First off, there was no narration, even though there is narration in practically every other episode of the show. And secondly, instead of pulling Annie and Clarabelle like he'd usually do while transporting passengers, he was pulling a green express coach. The episode then showed Thomas approaching a station, presumably the one where he would drop off the passengers. He tried to apply his brakes, and they failed. That's exactly what my boss said was supposed to happen. Thomas went straight through the station, unable to stop, as the people on the station gave confused looks. The classic runaway theme used in the show during situations similar to these started playing. Next, there was a shot of the front of Thomas. There was a scared expression on his face. It showed him passing a sign reading, "Danger, engines must not pass this board," similar to the one seen in the 25th episode of the first season, Down the Mine. This episode was already slightly intense for children, but it didn't seem too bad yet. Then, there was a shot of the passengers inside the coach. They were all screaming in terror. A wide shot showed Thomas passing a siding where Edward was resting. Edward noticed what was happening and sped onto the track, going towards Thomas. Soon we got to the coach. However, since it was a coach, there was no one there to couple Edward up to it. This was a serious problem. There was another shot of the inside of the coach with more screens. There was an extremely wide shot showing Thomas getting dangerously close to the unfinished bridge. His driver said, "The brakes are working again." By far, that was the only speaking line in the entire episode besides the screams. Then it showed Thomas. He was probably supposed to apply his brakes, but he didn't. The runaway theme began to slow down and become lower in pitch. He plunged straight over the side of the bridge with the coach. I saw Edward brake behind him, just before he went over too. Thomas and the coach landed on a bunch of rocks, getting battered before falling into a stream. There was one more shot of the inside of the coach, now half submerged in water. Dead bodies were everywhere. The screen faded to static for about 10 seconds before a scene was then shown of Edward watching in terror as Sir Topham Hatt used a blowtorch to take off a now broken and battered Thomas's face, which showed an expression of pure pain and horror. Tears were running down his cheeks. Sir Topham Hatt took off his face, which immediately became lifeless, and threw it into a nearby pool of molten metal. The face melted. "You deserve this, and much more," Topham said angrily. It showed Edward was at the smelter's yard, pushing a flatbed of Thomas's remains towards a giant metal claw hanging from the ceiling. "Goodbye, Thomas. I never expected it to end like this, but it did," Edward murmured. I watched as the claw came down and grabbed Thomas's remains. It pulled him upward and dropped him into the huge pool of molten metal. He melted in the pool on screen. His face melted last, which was horrifying enough. The last shot of the episode showed Edward leaving the smelter's yard with a depressed expression on his face. I took the VHS tape out of the VCR and snapped it in half. Nobody would ever see the horrific excuse for an episode again. Later, I noticed that the username of the Amazon account which sold me the tape wasn't just random letters and numbers. It was something encoded in base 64, an encoding scheme that converted words into random letters, numbers, and sometimes other characters. After running the username through a base 64 decoder, it came out with a URL for a website. When I visited the website, it was just a couple of sentences written on a blank page. But those sentences scared me.
Children need to know what really happens in the world. I'll make sure it's not hidden